June 19, 1944, 0530 hours, the Philippine Sea. Vice Admiral Jisaburō Ozawa stood on the bridge of his flagship Taiho and watched the eastern horizon begin to glow. In less than 2 hours, he would give the order that would define his career. The order that would send Japan's last great carrier air arm into battle. Around him, the mobile fleet stretched across miles of ocean. 9 aircraft carriers. The largest carrier force Japan had assembled since the attack on Pearl Harbor. 430 aircraft waited on flight decks, engines cold, pilots reviewing their mission briefings one final time. Ozawa had waited years for this moment. 2 years since Midway, when Japan had lost 4 carriers in a single afternoon. 2 years of watching American forces push westward across the Pacific, island by island, base by base. 2 years of diminishing returns and dwindling hope. Now, at last, he had the chance to strike back. At 7:30, he gave the order. The first wave began to launch. 70 aircraft rose from the flight decks of Taiho, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. Zeros, Judy dive bombers, Jill torpedo planes. They circled once above the fleet, formed up, and turned east toward the American carriers. By the end of the day, Ozawa would launch 373 aircraft in 4 separate waves. He believed he was sending them to victory. He could not know that by sunset, only 130 would return. Ozawa was not a fool. At 58 years old, he had spent his entire adult life in the Imperial Japanese Navy. He had studied at the Naval Academy when Japan was still celebrating its victory over Russia at Tsushima. He had commanded cruisers, battleships, carrier divisions. He had watched the rise of naval aviation from curious experiment to dominant weapon. He knew the numbers were against him. Over 1,000 American planes against his 430. American bases on captured islands within striking range. Supply lines stretching back to California, where factories worked 3 shifts around the clock. But Ozawa believed in something the numbers could not measure. He believed in the decisive battle, the concentrated blow that could change everything in a single morning. It had worked at Pearl Harbor, when 6 carriers had crippled the American Pacific Fleet in 2 hours. It had worked in the Dutch East Indies. It had shattered the British at Ceylon. Kantai-Kessen, the decisive fleet battle. That was the doctrine Ozawa had grown up with, the concentrated strike that would break the enemy's will to fight. Ozawa believed his pilots could still deliver that blow. What he did not know was how much had changed in 2 years of war. He looked at his pilot rosters and saw numbers that seemed adequate. 400 aircraft, enough for multiple strike waves. But those numbers hid a terrible truth. Most of his pilots had barely 100 hours of flight training. Some had even less. Pre-war aviators had trained for 300 hours or more before being assigned to carrier duty. The veterans of Pearl Harbor and Midway, the men who could land on a pitching deck in rough seas, who could navigate by dead reckoning across hundreds of miles of ocean, who could hold formation under fire. Those men were mostly dead now, and Japan had never built a system to replace them. The pre-war Navy had graduated pilots in small batches, elite aviators, carefully selected, intensively trained. It was a system designed for a short, decisive war, not for a war of attrition against an industrial giant. By 1944, aviation fuel was so scarce that training flights were rationed. Young pilots arrived at fleet units with flight time that American cadets would have considered barely sufficient for solo flight. Ozawa did not know what the Americans had built while Japan struggled. He did not know that American flight schools were graduating 17,000 new naval aviators every year. That training carriers cruised off both coasts, launching and recovering students all day long. That gunnery ranges consumed more ammunition in a week than some Japanese squadrons saw in a month. He did not know that American pilots entered combat with 600 hours of flight time. 6 times what his own men had, and he did not know what was waiting for his pilots over the horizon. Not just American carriers, not just American aircraft, a system. Radar that could detect his aircraft at 150 miles. Fighter direction centers that could calculate intercept vectors in real time. Hellcat fighters that could climb to meet his formations before they ever saw their targets. proximity-fused anti-aircraft shells that did not need a direct hit to kill. Ozawa saw none of this from his bridge. He saw only the morning sky, the rising aircraft, and the chance he had been given. The night before, he had issued a message to his fleet in the tradition of Admiral Togo before Tsushima. This operation has immense bearing on the fate of the empire. It is hoped that the forces will exert their utmost and achieve results as magnificent as those of the Battle of Tsushima. He believed it was still possible. The first reports should have come back around 10 o'clock. Ozawa's staff had calculated everything carefully. The distance to the American carriers, approximately 300 miles. The flight time at cruise speed, the fuel consumption, the time needed for attack runs and return flight. By mid-morning, the first wave should have found the enemy, should have begun its attack, should have sent back reports of hits and damage. Ozawa waited on the bridge of Taiho. He waited for reports of burning American flight decks, explosions ripping through enemy carriers, torpedo hits below the waterline. Instead, he got fragments, broken transmissions that cut off mid-sentence, partial messages that mentioned heavy opposition and scattered formation. And then, worst of all, silence. The radio operators strained to hear through the static. They called out frequencies, listened for responses, heard nothing. Where were the jubilant reports of torpedoes striking home? Where were the confirmations of dive bomber hits? Where were his aircraft? Staff officers exchanged glances across the plotting table. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Ozawa's face remained impassive. He had commanded men in battle before. He knew the value of showing no emotion when subordinates were watching, but something cold began to form in his stomach. A feeling he had not experienced since the reports came back from Midway. What Ozawa could not see was what was happening 200 miles to the east. His pilots had found the American task force. They had seen the carriers spread across the ocean, the screening destroyers and cruisers, the targets they had been sent to destroy. They had begun their attack runs, just as they had been trained. And they had flown into a killing ground, unlike anything Japanese naval aviation had ever faced. American radar had detected Ozawa's first wave at 150 miles. Long before any Japanese pilot could see the American ships, American radar operators were tracking the incoming formation on their glowing screens. At 10 o'clock, radar picked up the first wave. The Fighter Direction Center aboard USS Lexington calculated the intercept. Bearing, speed, altitude. Where would the Japanese be in 20 minutes? In 30 minutes? And where should the Hellcats be waiting for them? By the time Ozawa's first wave reached the American carriers, there were more than 300 Hellcats in the sky. Not scattered randomly, not flying random patrols. Positioned precisely, stacked at different altitudes, vectored to the exact point where radar predicted the Japanese would arrive. The Hellcat was not a graceful aircraft. It was not designed for the elegant turning battles the Zero had dominated in 1942. It was built to dive, to shoot, and to survive. 6 .50 caliber machine guns that could tear a Zero apart in a 2-second burst. 2,000 horsepower that could outclimb any Japanese fighter. Self-sealing fuel tanks that would not explode when hit. Armor plate behind the pilot's head that could stop a cannon shell. A product of Grumman factories on Long Island, building these aircraft faster than Japan could train pilots to fight them. Ozawa's pilots never had a chance to deliver their concentrated blow. They were intercepted 50 miles from the American carriers. Groups of 5 and 10 Japanese aircraft, flying in neat formations as they had been trained, suddenly found Hellcats diving on them from above and behind. Many never saw the attackers. Their aircraft simply exploded, or spiraled toward the sea trailing smoke, or came apart under the weight of concentrated machine gun fire. At 11:07, radar detected the second wave. 107 aircraft. They were met 60 miles out. At least 70 were shot down before they even saw the American ships. On Taiho's bridge, Ozawa received none of this in detail. He received only the growing silence, the missing reports, the transmissions that simply stopped mid-word. By noon, the pattern was undeniable. Ozawa had launched his second wave around 8:56. 107 aircraft, the largest strike of the day. Then a third wave at 10 o'clock. then a fourth. Each time, he sent more aircraft into the eastern sky. Each time, fewer came back. The reports that did arrive were devastating in their brevity. Heavy fighter opposition encountered. Formation scattered by enemy interceptors. Unable to press attack. Few aircraft returning from strike. Ozawa stood at his plotting table and watched his staff mark the losses with grim efficiency. First wave, launched 69 aircraft, returned approximately 24. Second wave, launched 107 aircraft, returned less than 40. Third wave, launched 47 aircraft, returned 7. Fourth wave, launched 82 aircraft, returned 9. The numbers told a story that no amount of hope could change. His air groups were being annihilated. What Ozawa did not know was that the Americans had already given this battle a name. They were calling it the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. American pilots would later describe the day with something close to embarrassment. It had been too easy, too one-sided, more like target practice than combat. It was like shooting fish in a barrel, one pilot reported. They came in perfect formations, just like the training films. We picked them off one by one. Lieutenant Commander David McCampbell shot down 7 Japanese aircraft. Lieutenant Alexander Vraciu shot down 6 in a single engagement. He landed on his carrier, held up 6 fingers for the photographers, and said he could have gotten more if he had not run out of ammunition. The Hellcats were running out of bullets before they ran out of targets. For Ozawa, each hour brought new reports of squadrons that had not returned, radio frequencies that had gone permanently silent, aircraft that had simply vanished somewhere between his carriers and the American fleet. Flight deck crews stood waiting for aircraft that would never come. Landing signal officers had nothing to guide home. The returning pilots, the handful who made it back, spoke of chaos in the sky, of Hellcats everywhere, of anti-aircraft fire so thick it looked like a wall. New American shells that exploded near aircraft without hitting them. Proximity fuses, a secret weapon. Shells that could sense when they were close enough and detonate automatically, filling the air with shrapnel. And still, Ozawa had not received a single confirmed report of an American carrier sunk or seriously damaged. He had thrown everything he had at the enemy, and the enemy had barely felt it. But Ozawa's nightmare was not over. At 8:16 that morning, while he was watching his first wave launch, something had happened beneath the waves. The American submarine USS Albacore had been tracking Ozawa's carrier group. Her commanding officer, Commander James Blanchard, maneuvered into attack position and fired 6 torpedoes at the largest target he could see. That target was Taiho, Ozawa's flagship, Japan's newest and most advanced carrier. 5 torpedoes missed, 1 hit. The impact came forward, near the aviation gasoline storage tanks. A Japanese pilot named Sakio Komatsu, just launched with the second wave, saw one of the incoming torpedoes and deliberately crashed his aircraft into it. A heroic sacrifice that destroyed the torpedo, but cost him his life. But the one torpedo that hit was enough. The damage seemed manageable at first. Taiho was built with an armored flight deck, designed to absorb bombs. Her damage control teams went to work. The ship continued flight operations. But the torpedo had ruptured fuel lines. Aviation gasoline fumes began seeping through the ship. Damage control teams, inexperienced with this kind of situation, made a fatal decision. They increased ventilation to clear the fumes. Instead, they spread the explosive vapors throughout the ship. For hours, Taiho was a floating bomb. Ozawa did not know it. He continued to receive reports, to issue orders, to wait for news from his vanishing air groups. At 15:32, the fumes found a spark. The explosion broke Taiho's back. Officers grabbed Ozawa and pulled him toward the bridge wing. There was no time to save the ship. Within minutes, it was clear the flagship was dying. Ozawa transferred to the destroyer Wakatsuki by Breach's buoy. He watched from the smaller ship as Taiho, the most advanced carrier Japan had ever built, rolled over and sank. 1,600 men went down with her. But Taiho was not alone. Around noon, while Ozawa's air groups were being slaughtered over the American fleet, another American submarine had found his carriers. USS Kavala fired a spread of torpedoes at Shokaku. Shokaku, the veteran carrier that had launched aircraft against Pearl Harbor. The carrier that had survived the Coral Sea and Santa Cruz. 3 torpedoes struck her. Fires spread through her hangar decks. Aviation fuel ignited. Bombs and torpedoes stored below began to cook off in the heat. By 1501, Shokaku was gone. 2 fleet carriers, sunk not by enemy aircraft, but by American submarines. Submarines that were products of the same industrial system that had built the Hellcats, and the radar, and the training bases. Each loss meant not only the ship, but irreplaceable aircraft, irreplaceable mechanics and armorers, irreplaceable deck crews who knew how to run flight operations. The human infrastructure of carrier warfare, gone beneath the waves. Ozawa, now commanding from a cruiser, received these reports throughout the afternoon. His face showed nothing, but his staff could see it in his eyes. This was not a battle anymore. This was a disaster. By evening on June 19th, Ozawa tried to count what remained. His staff compiled the numbers, the lists of aircraft that had returned, the lists of those that had not. Of the 373 aircraft launched that day, approximately 130 had made it back to friendly decks. 243 were gone into the Pacific, shot down by Hellcats, destroyed by anti-aircraft fire, ditched when they ran out of fuel trying to find carriers that no longer existed. And what had they accomplished? Ozawa asked for damage reports on the American fleet. The answer came back: minimal. 1 bomb hit on the battleship South Dakota. Minor damage. No American carriers touched. The enemy fleet was completely intact. He had thrown Japan's last carrier air arm against the American task force, and the Americans had barely noticed. That night, Ozawa's surviving carriers retreated westward, trying to put distance between themselves and the enemy. But the battle was not over. On June 20th, American search planes finally located his retreating fleet. At 1600 hours, they reported the position. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commanding Task Force 58, faced a decision. The Japanese were at extreme range. His pilots would be flying at the edge of their fuel capacity. They would have to attack, then fly back in darkness, with barely enough gas to reach their carriers. Standard doctrine said, do not risk it. Mitcher looked at the situation and made his choice. At 1621, he launched everything he had. 216 aircraft headed west. The American strike reached Ozawa's fleet near sunset. Bombs and torpedoes slammed into the carrier Hio, setting her ablaze. Other carriers took damage. Ozawa's ability to conduct any further air operations effectively ended with the burning wreckage. But now the American pilots faced their own crisis. It was dark. They were low on fuel. They were scattered across hundreds of miles of ocean, and finding their carriers in the blackness of the Pacific night was almost impossible. Standard doctrine called for blackout. Keep the lights off. Do not reveal the fleet's position to enemy submarines. Mitcher looked at the reports of his pilots, circling in the darkness, running out of fuel, and he gave an order that would be remembered as long as men told stories of the sea. Turn on the lights. Searchlights, signal lamps, flight deck lights, star shells fired by destroyers to guide the pilots home. The American fleet lit up the Pacific Ocean. It was a risk. Submarines might find them, but Mitcher could afford the risk, because his industrial system could replace whatever he lost. The pilots he saved that night would fly again tomorrow. The aircraft lost would be replaced next month. The carriers themselves were coming off American shipyard slips faster than Japan could build destroyers. 80 American aircraft were lost that night, ditching in the sea or crashing on deck. But most of the pilots were rescued. And Ozawa, somewhere in the darkness to the west, reading his casualty lists by dim light, had no such options. Every pilot he had lost was irreplaceable. Every aircraft gone would never return. Every carrier sunk represented years of construction Japan could no longer afford. While the American admiral turned on his lights, the Japanese admiral counted his dead. In the days after the battle, Ozawa submitted his report to Tokyo. He took full responsibility for the defeat. He offered his resignation. It was refused. Japan had no admirals left who could replace him. The official Japanese figures would record approximately 476 aircraft lost, 346 carrier planes, the rest land-based. 3 fleet carriers sunk: Taiho, Shokaku, Hyo. American losses: 123 aircraft, mostly operational. No ships sunk, 26 pilots and 43 aircrew killed. It was one of the most lopsided naval battles in history. But Ozawa understood something that the official reports would never fully capture. He had not lost because his pilots lacked courage. They had flown into certain death without hesitation. He had not lost because of bad luck. The submarines, the radar, the fighters, they had all worked exactly as the Americans had designed them to work. He had lost because he was fighting a system. A system that trained pilots faster than Japan could recruit them. That built aircraft faster than Japan could design them. That produced radar sets and proximity fuses and self-sealing fuel tanks in quantities Japan could not imagine. A system that could afford to turn on lights in submarine-infested waters because it could replace whatever it lost. His navy had believed in the decisive battle. One great engagement that would change everything. But there was no decisive battle against an enemy who could lose and lose and lose and still come back stronger every month. After the Philippine Sea, Japanese carriers would still sail, but their flight decks would remain mostly empty. Their pilots would be transferred to shore bases for kamikaze missions, the final admission that conventional air power was no longer an option. The desperate hope of one final decisive battle would fade into the grim reality of industrial attrition. Ozawa survived the war. He lived until 1966, long enough to see Japan rebuilt, long enough to see his country transformed into an economic power. He never wrote a memoir. He rarely spoke of the Philippine Sea, not because Japan had lost a battle, but because Japan had never had the factories, the oil fields, the training bases, the industrial depth to fight the kind of war America was waging. Courage against systems, spirit against logistics. The last carrier Admiral had launched 373 aircraft at dawn. By sunset, only 130 came back. And with them died the age of Japanese carrier aviation. Thank you for watching Tales of Valor. If this story moved you, please like and subscribe to help us continue bringing these forgotten World War II stories to life. Where are you watching from today?